Hi everyone, my name is Basile. Welcome back from lunch. Obviously, I hope you had a good one. I work at the Starling Lab for Data Integrity, a co-creation of Stanford University and the USC Shoah Foundation. Our object of research is data integrity as defined by provenance systems, so digital signatures attached to digital media, as well as data integrity. Can you tell what is an original from a non-exact, inauthentic copy? And we've been applying these questions, or researching these questions from the perspectives of history and archiving, journalism and law, which is a department I do my best to lead as the director of special projects, and that has included, over the last couple of years, our response to the ground invasion in Ukraine, as well as international criminal accountability and war crimes investigation. I mention this because it really is, I've gone too fast, must not hit this button. The conduit for our work are digital investigations or open source investigations. If you've seen any type of the output from visual investigations, news media team, or sort of Bellingcats of the world, you should have a good idea of what this stuff looks like. Open source definition in this context must be disambiguated from open source code. We mostly talk about material which is publicly-ish accessible and sources that more or less anyone could have reached, and that's really meant in opposition to material which is not open access, heavily privileged, for example. There's a large gray area between what is open and what is closed. I highly recommend this reading, Digital Witness, a great book which sets the tone and the sort of practices for this type of work. I've selected 3 small vignettes, an example, to give you an idea of this type of work. The first one is our investigation with Rolling Stone magazine into the identity of a person whom we allege committed acts tantamount to war crime in Bosnia in the 1990s. We went back to old photographs, set them in a sort of 3D space, reconstructed a sort of picture, and identified this particular soldier, and then documented through social media research and a bit of forensics that this person still lives in and around Sarajevo, practices as a DJ in festivals, and has a strong following, and lives away from any kind of criminal accountability. The second example, also heavily relying on completely open material, Telegram posts, tweets, as well as supporting information from public local media, is our submission to the International Criminal Court into the alleged deliberate targeting of schools in Kharkiv at the beginning of a ground invasion. This was also substantiated by photos from the field from trained war crimes investigators. And I'll come back in a minute, it's less relevant. And then finally, the third project I had selected from Air Wars, an organization I co-created 10 or 11 years ago, which relies on publicly accessible tweeted videos and media by the Israeli military into acts in a densely populated area, which is Gaza, and the reconstruction they've created and how they've substantiated the claims they're making through publicly accessible media and web archives is most interesting. I've picked these 3 topics and these 3 examples to give you an idea and really emphasize the diversity that lies in this work and the diversity of this work. You have various types of documents, photographs, and web pages, which are encountered by people who used to work with very different tools. And actually, web archives, as we define them in the room and at the conference today, so WACZ and WACZs, are not extremely prevalent. They tend to be a bit more cumbersome than your sort of run-of-the-mill screenshot or Hunchly tool. They weigh a bit more, they take a minute, well, not a minute, but they take a few seconds to open in a replay. They're difficult to full text search, and so you would rarely see these kind of tools in the wild. But you do need to go through the material, you do need to peer through it to get your leads and work up your story. I also want to add that one of the concerns, and I'll come back to this in a minute, is that truth is often fairly complex and nuanced and subject to different perspectives. And that is a difficult topic to account for in the design of a research tool, of a curation of a database of very conflicting claims by several actors. And then finally, a big concern for us supporting these digital investigations team is the brittleness of the whole ecosystem and the scarcity of funds, which rules out some commercial solutions, some idiosyncrasies regarding operational security, ruling out part of a sort of Google or Microsoft ecosystem because you don't want Google to see your stuff. And so you end up removing quite a lot of options, even with simple subscription models. When they start working in the 3 digits, you end up sometimes working against yourself. Our job, I've got this diagram here to essentially show that our job as studying the carrying out of these investigations is really to try to not get in the way as much as possible so we can observe what is going on. It's not important from a substance perspective. It's just meant to show that on the left-hand side, we essentially cater to different kinds of input data. I mentioned photographs coming from the field. These photographs come from specific smartphone apps. We've been working on specific cameras with Sony and Canon, which have special chip in them, so you get the hashes in the signature direct from camera. And web archives are very present because they're huge to substantiate ex post, so after the fact, what may or may not have been taking place. They occupy a huge part in our ecosystem, and I'm going to come back to that. So the glue between all this stuff and the way we have started to think about enabling curation, research, organization, and also the circulation and the discovery. This was a topic this morning in some of the sessions. Is a tool built on Hypercore and Hyper-B. We've started to refer to, excuse me for very poor branding, called authenticated attributes. It essentially is a key value database pair which puts provenance and integrity front and center. Nothing can be written in there that isn't being timestamped, that isn't properly signed, and that isn't going to travel further afield without these markers. It supports all your sort of asset management system over the wire, so adding text, adding a caption, moving to a sub-collection, setting relations. An asset is derived from another. Any kind of ontology that you can express in sort of RDF format is fairly supported. And crucially, it aims to enable downstream users from this. So data is then republished under the shape of feeds, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But essentially, you open up your research to other users. Again, the idea is that metadata is verifiable. So think of it as an authenticated attributes database as a big spreadsheet. The unique quality of this spreadsheet is that each and every cell is uniquely, independently verifiable, traceable, well, trackable, I should say, exportable, and can be accessed on its own without downloading the whole document. It's very important if you end up with a giant data set. It can be discovered if you know, for example, the hash of the asset. If you can search on an index, you can find this information, and it can be exported to play nice with asset management software, including case building software if you're talking on the enterprise side of things. All these key values, so this one, for example, location set to the string Kharkiv, Ukraine, that's a value. The key would be the location. All these are anchored on an asset's hash, or in this instance, a CID, which has other types of property. The asset is super relevant, whether this is a WACZ, whether this is a photograph, whether this is a PDF document or an encrypted, zip file. This is what we anchor the metadata to. And a good example of this is, obviously, we deal with a lot of web archives or studies from verifications done on the web. My personal journey to this concept was from the open source intelligence, like verifying a tweet and substantiating some of the elements therein. Came in contact with Web Recorder and the creation of a WACZ format. The unique quality from my perspective 4 years ago was that the hashes of the assets themselves were contained in the data package, and you would sign the lot before it reaches the confines of our system. So in other words, even in this system, you have your provenance and integrity data in the form of hashes and digital signatures. Alongside your WACZ payload, this comes into our system. This is very much first-class invisibility. Again, think of your spreadsheet. The cell that shows who signed this web archive is obviously signed by a different cryptographic signer than the one where my chief investigator went in and said, well, this web page represents a photo which was allegedly taken in eastern Ukraine. Different signers, different origins, trackable completely independently. Very important for evidentiary purposes. I've picked up a couple of examples to give you an idea of some of the features or some of the properties that we deemed were important for this work. The first one is a report from the DFR lab at the Atlantic Council, sort of huge powerhouse in open source and in NATO circles, which, from a substance perspective, studied a corpus of news media pre-large-scale invasion in 2022, showing that essentially a few discrete 4, 5, or 6 main narratives were being pushed by pro-Kremlin sources. This material was extremely vulnerable. We assessed, we preserved it all. This represents about 10,000 web pages. Some of them are gone, and I can't even assess the substance of how much. But the question after the publication of the report, from my perspective, was so what? We have these 10,000 things which were manually categorized by 3 people who are experts in Russian-speaking news media. We decided to republish part of this information through authenticated attributes. This is a sort of JSON-type representation. Bear in mind that each of these key-value pairs is, again, independently verifiable, trackable, and attributable to the person who made this. This is through our CLI tool. Some of these key values come from my team. Some of these key values come from the person. Some of these come from the person who worked at the DFR lab at the time. All this is accessible. This could be a bit too small, but all this is accessible through an HTTP API as well. Excuse the sort of montage to be able to show you the representation of this. So discoverability of this information was what we tried to achieve by republishing this feed of metadata. The web archives themselves are not accessible in this instance. It costs too much in terms of egress, so we decided to not make them available. Another example where discovery of metadata is interesting is a project of mine which I started a long time ago with this organization, Airwars, Index for Accountability, which addresses a need we've discovered in the context of monitoring Syrian crisis, Twitter, where you have several very professional organizations who were there in the long run, Bellingcat being one of them, the Syrian Network for Human Rights, Airwars, and many others, as well as a UN catalyst for independent, for IIIM mechanism, which potentially can gather support for things. Now, in the concept of this index, every organization would have their own database, their own, personal idiosyncratic way of organizing their data and representing what they want to show. But if 2 organizations were to preserve the same, say, URL or receive the same photographs from the 3 guys in Raqqa, there would be the ability to discover the metadata written by other organizations in this tiny circle of trust, because each and every one of them, through authenticated attributes, effectively distributes this feed of information. This is a real-world example from the same group, European Court of Human Rights case for the downing of MH17 over Ukraine. The DFR lab and Bellingcat had the same photograph and preferred the same photograph as evidence, except the Bellingcat photo had been edited by the soldier in this photo. I didn't reproduce it because there's tanks and shit. But they didn't know. The photo they had was effectively one that had been edited. This information would have been discoverable by the Bellingcat team if DFR Lab had essentially published, even to a small circle of trust, the fact that they knew, because they had preserved the photo twice and included it in their own report, that this was would have been findable. I'm going to skip my next slide because Megan is going to whistle at me over here. I just wanted to say that the way we've been thinking about provenance, integrity, and I guess discoverability is to shift the focus from detection tools or detection ideas. I'm going to detect what is fake, and I'm going to say what is not fake or what is authentic. Put forward on the open web more trustworthy material, which is supported by additional corroborating contextual metadata. The idea being to support pluralistic assessments by my people, source-based, so you go to your, you find this asset, you find this social media post, whatever, and you're able to go to the source and see the organizations that have or have not verified it and in which way. And we think this ecosystem would be richer and a better way to address some of the crises of our current information environment. Thank you very much.